Big thanks to Joan for that very nice introduction, and thanks for all of you for coming. This is quite a large auditorium, so it's nice to see a number of bodies. I'll try and span the room when I talk. But very honored to be here and excited. NSCA is one of my favorite organizations, particularly because of the diversity. And so it's really fun for me as a researcher to be able to take some of the things that we do in the lab and provide it to a lot of practitioners that can really change and utilize what we're doing. However, it's a little bit hard to put together a talk to kind of touch upon the practitioners and the clinicians as well as the researchers. So my hope today is to really be able to provide some information that at least allow you to take away one pearl of knowledge to use in your everyday life or use with your clients, or stimulate a question for me that maybe can help me come up with a new research idea. So the title of my talk, I'm going to really be talking about some aspects of body composition, metabolism, and incorporating exercise and nutrition. Before we begin, just a general conflict of interest nature. I do have research funding from the NIH and some industry-sponsored trials, and that is based on some of the data that I'll present today. So general objectives today. I think there's a big misunderstanding of body composition, so I want to briefly give kind of an overview there and maybe give you a different insight on how to view body composition measurement and what those values mean. Talk about evidence-based strategies for improving body composition, maximizing fat loss, and nutritional manipulation. I'm sure many of you just came from Bill Campbell's talk. He did a great foundational view of some of the things I'm going to talk about. And to be honest, I was a bit selfish. I wanted to pack a ton in this to give you all kind of a different view, or at least, like I said, take a diverse view on some aspects of the research. And then I also briefly wanted to talk about metabolism, or some key pieces of metabolism that are often overlooked, and maybe a different perspective that you can look at with your clients or in the research lab. So to begin, body composition is a passion of mine, partly because it's widely misunderstood and it's an area that we can do a lot more research in, but also because there's a big practical application. And let's be honest, most of us want to be a little bit leaner or lighter or bigger muscles, right? So it's nice to study that. So first, just a brief overview, kind of just to set the tone. With body composition, it can play an important role in a number of things, but when you think about how you might apply it in the lab or with your clients, you can really use body composition to formulate more evidence-based diet and exercise recommendations. We can evaluate sex-based differences with an exercise or nutrition program. So I'm really interested in how men and women respond differently or the same to exercise and nutrition. And then we've also used it as an interesting way to monitor injury status, injury risk, and return to kind of play. But it's rarely used, and so I can't see any of you because the lights are so bright, but I would ask you who uses body composition, and some of you probably do, but it's expensive, it's really hard to interpret, it takes a lot of time, and it's costly. But there are some key things, and what I would even encourage you to do is to collaborate with your resources around you, or dedicate your time to one small piece of measurement, whether it be skin folds or A-mode ultrasound, or collaborate with someone that does DEXA. I want to give you some key kind of things to look at. And another view, too, is that you really can't tell by looking at a person what their body composition is. Sometimes it does need to be measured, and it really allows you to track some changes. So one thing I just wanted to put out there, when I was going through school, the gold standard was underwater weighing or hydrostatic weighing, still in some textbooks. However, what we know is the gold standard is the multi-compartment model, or 4C model, which is here. And basically, we know that the more compartments you measure, the more accurate the body composition. So we use that as a gold standard. But it takes a lot of time and money and resources. And so what we've done in our lab is to create a 4-compartment model just using DEXA and a body water measurement. So essentially, we can measure, we can measure fat mass, lean mass, and bone from DEXA and determine body volume, which we would normally use from a bod pod We can use the DEXA and then use a total body water measurement. So essentially creating a gold standard with much less time. And partly why I share this is really more for an accuracy description. So I've given you an example here. If we've done a 4C model, if we take a 20-year-old female, you can see her stats there, body volume measured by BOD-POD, total body water by a bioelectrical impedance. DEXA is going to give us bone mineral content. You can see the body volume differences from BOD-POD, 76.2 liters, versus DEXA-derived body volume, 76.1. So very accurate, very similar. When we apply this comparing different types of body composition measures, you can see the 4C gold standard gives us a 35.7% body fat. BIS alone, which is a body water, very handheld, cheap, inexpensive, you can see 32.6%. BOD-POD, so forth and so on. You can see that 4C model, DEXA-derived, is fairly accurate with that 4C gold standard. So why I'm telling you this is it's important to recognize the error within the device that you're using and be comfortable with that error. So it could be, plus or minus 3%, plus or minus 6%, and let me show you an application to that. So really, we're usually more interested in the change or how sensitive a measurement might be. So I would generally consider a good device error of 3%, plus or minus 3%. So that would mean maybe today I'm 30% body fat, maybe tomorrow I'm 33% body fat, and that would still be fairly reliable. So that means when you measure body composition, you need to make sure you're not measuring it too frequently because you won't be able to detect that change. So for example, if you have a 200-pound male at 20% body fat, you can see the stats. After a 3% loss, fat loss, that's a weight of 194 pounds. That's a 6-pound loss of fat, which any of you trying to lose weight with your clients or induce that, that's a pretty big change. But basically, if you split that up 1 to 2 weeks, that gives you a minimum of 3 weeks. And I bring this up because when I was a college athlete, I don't know if Dr. Mayhew is in the room, but he used to measure body composition on the cross-country team like every 2 weeks, and it was my least favorite day of the season. And my argument would be they're really not detecting changes, right? It's not real enough to change. So that's something to keep in mind is the device error and then how frequently of measurement. And then I just wanted to put this in perspective. Obviously, the amount or cost of the device is important. So if you're measuring using total body water, that's going to be a higher percent fat needed to be deemed real. So you can see up to 4%, 3.8, 4%. BOD-POD is fairly reliable, so a smaller change, same thing with DEXA by itself. But the more compartments you can measure, for example, if you can do total body water and a BOD-POD, your error becomes less and you become more sensitive to that change. So with that, I want to show you how we can apply this. So one concept that my lab is interested in is in the concept of fat-free mass index. This was the original paper that we published, really looking at the previous published fat-free mass index data demonstrated that an upper limit of fat-free mass index that someone could have was fairly low. So basically 25 kilograms per meter squared. And what this all means is, or kind of the way I view it, is a value that you can use to kind of anticipate how much muscle mass someone can hold. So if you have someone that's, let's say a freshman coming in to work with you or someone that's untrained, if you can estimate their fat-free mass index, you can see maybe where they're at for their male counterpart. I'll give you some female values here and say, okay, they're on the low end of the spectrum and they can gain 5 kilograms of fat-free mass. Or maybe they're on the upper limit and we know that they're kind of at their upper limit. So you can see this as a neat figure when my doc students put together looking at a fat-free mass index spectrum. And you can see at the upper limit is 32 kilograms per meter squared. So in this case, if you have a football player that has a fat-free mass index of 30, you know that he's at that upper limit. And to date, there's no data on females. So I pulled this together, and one of my other doc students presented some of this data earlier. You can see the upper limit is much lower, but the best example here is notice that a 12.8 is a very low value. value. So we generally have that from our cross-country runners. If you're on the low end, we know, which I'll show you here in a second, that low lean mass is more of a predictor of injury and stress fracture in cross-country athletes. So we can maybe shoot to increase their fat-free mass index and put them on a better spectrum. So let me show you, and this will eventually write up, but seeing some of the sex-related maximum fat-free mass index may be valuable to calculate. The other thing to kind of think about is muscle characteristics. So this is probably more of a laboratory-based measure, but I want to provide it because it's kind of insightful when we look at some of the applications. So basically, being able to measure muscle size or quality, what's in the muscle. So for example, about how much adipose tissue, connective tissue. I always like to show a picture of steak. You may never look at steak the same, but that fatty infiltration, our muscles are very similar, right? And a lower muscle quality has less, or better muscle quality has less fat infiltration and is more like a fillet, right? So when we look at some of the applications of this, muscle characteristics can be helpful. So let's look at one approach to exercise in cross-country. We have some interesting data on cross-country and endurance-based athletes and how it may influence body composition. So specifically, we wanted to characterize body composition in this group because there's very little data, as well as look at stress fracture and kind of some indicators there because there's also very little data. And so you can see one thing I'll point out is the percent fat category. Notice that these individuals, despite being male and female cross-country athletes, are really not that lean. So about 20 to 16, 17 to 20% body fat. And then there's significantly more or higher body fat in that group of individuals with a stress fracture. And then when we look at some other muscle characteristics, they had lower lean mass, lower muscle size, and poorer muscle quality. So essentially, we took this and shared this with our strength staff and basically said, there's one way you can fix all these reoccurring stress fractures, and that's lift heavier weights or incorporate that into volume. And they listened. We need to retest and look at some of this. But you can notice, too, that bone mineral density and bone mineral content were not different between groups. So a different view of how muscle may be a better indicator or maybe a better approach to injury prevention. Now, I have a big interest in high-intensity interval training, and so just brief education. So a lot of the data, the foundational work is on sprint interval training, and that's like a repeated wind gate. Very effective. Hands of who's done a wind gate in here? Okay, so most of you, it sucks, right? And then for sprint interval training, you generally have to do 4 to 6 of them with 4 minutes of rest in between. And so it works, right? But part of what my lab spends a lot of time doing is looking at practical and feasible approaches to exercise and nutrition. This is not practical nor feasible. You need specialized equipment, and you need a lot of motivation. So I'm not sure my video will work here. I don't have a clicker, but this was an example of a wind gate. You can go try it on your own if you'd like to see it. Oh, it's going to work. My friend over there will hit it for us. So as she is doing it, part of why it's not feasible is because you have to have a percentage of your body weight that's dropped on the weight as you go. And so this individual, who happens to be in the audience, I won't call her out, that's part of the fun of working in my lab, right? You torture yourself. But she's very endurance-based, so she's actually doing a pretty good job maintaining power output. It lasts 30 seconds, and then rest for the sprint protocol, you rest 4 minutes. So one of the aspects of HIIT that is supposed to be important is that it's time effective. If you're resting 4 minutes in between 4 to 6 reps, you might as well just go do something else, right, in my opinion. So we've looked at some other approaches of HIIT, which is more 10 bouts of 1 minute on, 1 minute off, 5 bouts of 2 minutes on, 1 minute off, or 3 to 4 4-minute bouts of 3 minutes rest. We've used this in a number of situations and none of clinical populations, and I'll just, maybe you can play that quick. This one is a running version. And I just want to show you part of how we do it is we have the treadmill going, you jump on. This is running about 11 miles per hour, and then we have the individual jump off. Obviously, we modify it. We've done this with a lot of clinical populations. So some of the applications of this, I just wanted to show you how it might be an effective approach. And I'm sure you guys all know, like HIIT has caught on like wildfire, but I want to show you some of the evidence and really to think about how you do it. So these papers are based on the 2 minute on, 1 minute off, or 1 minute on, 1 minute off in overweight, obese individuals. And one thing, when I first tried to do this study, a lot of people said, there's no way you're going to get overweight and obese people to do this. And actually, it was the most highest compliance group I've had with no adverse effects, significant improvements in body composition and even greater in women, and then improvements in VO2 and insulin sensitivity. And then the other thing that we know and data is gathering is that we actually see a greater loss in abdominal and or visceral fat. Based on some of the physiological mechanisms, that visceral fat is targeted more. So this can be a very practical approach to improving cardiovascular and metabolic health as well. And then ours is one of the first labs to look at the influence of HIIT on muscle. So can you increase muscle from an aerobic type exercise? And you can. So we just published this paper that basically demonstrates that HIIT increases lean mass significantly, as well as improves cross-sectional area and echo intensity. And that's muscle quality. So essentially, in this particular study, we showed that 1 minute on, 1 minute off 10 times, 3 times a week in this particular study, significantly improved muscle cross-sectional area and lean body mass. So if you think about that, that becomes very important, or potential importance for being able to maintain or improve cardiovascular health while also improving body composition. We need to look a little bit more at mechanisms, kind of the neuromuscular changes, but some of that conversation came up and maybe some studies moving forward there. So let's talk a little bit about combining some of these with, or some views on nutritional approaches. So this was a study that I did a long time ago, but it's still, I think, one of the quintessential studies that looks at and kind of supports that notion that interval training combined with nutrition can actually be anabolic. And so this was 3 weeks of running on a treadmill. This protocol used 2 minutes on, 1 minute off. And it was originally designed to look at a supplement. So I necessarily wouldn't pick this supplement, but I think it's pretty insightful. So it was a pre-workout supplement that incorporated whey, creatine, a mushroom, and caffeine versus a carbohydrate. Significantly increased VO2 max, that's pretty standard. But body composition, or lean mass, was significantly elevated in that treatment group only. And I'll show you that here. So pretty interesting. And so it was about 1.5 kilograms in 3 weeks. And I'm kind of a body composition nerd, so the first question you should all ask, is that really significant? Did that pass the measurement error? And it did. So this tells me that there was a legitimate, real change in lean mass. And so that started me thinking, okay, what if we provide whey in our pre-workouts? Many of you will have amino acids in your pre-workouts, but you need all 9 essential amino acids to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So that whole whey may be anabolic combined with that interval training. So speaking of protein, Bill did a good job talking about kind of the importance, and we all know there's some really great data that talks about how much protein. So most of you, and if not, there's another pearl of knowledge. We know that it used to be thought that you should consume only 20 grams of protein per setting, per meal. That's all you could digest and absorb. What we now know is that it's more probably dependent on how much lean mass you have. So if you have more lean mass, you probably could consume upwards to 40 to 50 grams. And then this is a really great study, kind of more of a review that looks at, okay, so let's say that I'm already consuming a high protein diet, but my goal is still to increase lean mass. You probably have people like that, especially in this low carb phase. And what we know is that increasing lean mass and strength may be more dependent on that change in protein intake. So let me show you an example. So this review particularly suggests that you need a 60% increase in the amount of protein that you consume. So if we take a baseline 1.3 grams per kilogram per day of protein, here I've given you just a male and female example. So your male would be about 100 grams of protein, your female would be at about 83 grams of protein. And so a 60% increase from that 1.3 is going to be about 2.01 grams per kilogram per day, which some would suggest is that that's on the high protein diet, but it's getting that change. And so you can look at that value of protein, 155 grams for the male, 128 grams for the female. What the current literature suggests is that's really not too high. And it's maybe just a different way to look, or even if you yourself are trying to put on lean mass, maybe it's that change. So let's say you're already consuming 2 grams per kilogram of protein. Look and calculate a 60% greater increase, and that may be what you need to increase lean mass or stimulate lean mass and strength. And then kind of the other concept I want to talk about that hasn't or is often overlooked, but to me is a very simple, practical way to look at kind of body change, body composition changes, is manipulating macronutrients. So in this particular study, it was a weight loss intervention, 10 weeks, 1,700 calories, so nothing drastic. They labeled it a carbohydrate group and a protein group. But what I want you to kind of view is really the ratio of carb to protein. So you can see in the carbohydrate group, that's how most typical Americans eat. 3.5 to 1 is the ratio, so about 3.5 grams of carbohydrate to 1 gram of protein. So you can see that's about 240 grams of carbs versus 68 grams of protein. That's a pretty typical American consumption. Or a lower carb to protein ratio, you can see 1.4 grams of carbohydrate to 1 gram of protein. So you can see that's more of 171 grams to 125 grams of protein. So I want to talk about this because I'll show you some more application here. But basically, this study showed similar caloric intake, but that protein or lower carb to protein ratio lost more fat and maintained more lean mass and were more satiated, essentially. And that happened at about 4-week time period. And so I like this because it's not saying, in my mind, it's not really saying eat less, and it's not saying eat less carbs. It's really just saying pair your protein with your carbs. And if you change your mindset with researchers, with clients, it actually oftentimes means eating more food and thinking, being more conscious. And so it's an easy behavior change without saying don't eat all this or eat a whole lot less. And I'll show you some of that application. This is kind of not a follow-up study, but I'm not sure if you guys are aware. Well, one, I should make a disclaimer. I'm a big proponent of supplements because they're feasible and some of them work. And this study was in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2013 and basically said, second to bariatric surgery, a meal replacement is the most effective way for weight loss. And if you think about it, it makes sense because it's the least minimal changes to behavior, right? And so we did this study as a follow-up, or not a follow-up, but in conjunction when I was at University of Oklahoma, and basically provided a very high-quality meal replacement shake and had them consume whatever else they wanted throughout the day. We did have a supervised exercise group, and we measured a number of things. So I wanted to show you the supplement facts panel, and I'll call out this meal replacement is actually a 1 to 2 carb to protein ratio. And that's partly why it was so effective, because it's giving boluses of protein, and it was also high fiber. And so, and you can see 300 calories, and we actually had them consume 2 of them a day. Throughout the study. So I want to show you kind of some of the results. So when we look at that total calories did not change even though we said you can eat whatever you want. But the carbohydrate to protein ratio was significantly reduced when they started consuming one shake. And that, in my opinion, was the biggest factor that why we saw changes that we did. So percent fat was significantly reduced in that meal replacement group. And also we saw a number of blood changes, but total cholesterol was also reduced, and that's a fiber component. So if you're looking for a way to feasibly modify your clients or a research study, my evidence-based opinion is a meal replacement is potentially effective, and we've done this. It's just finding the right one and the right amount, and so that may be an effective way to modify carb to protein ratio. I'll show you some other examples too. This study Bill just presented, but I actually have a different view of it. So he talked about high protein versus low protein and weight loss, and it was with some resistance trained females. They incorporated resistance training and HIIT. And you can see they had different caloric intake, and that was by accident. I don't know if you were in his talk. But when I looked at this, it was high protein, 2.5 grams per kilogram per day. But when I calculated their carb to protein ratio, it was a 1-to-1. Even more ideal for fat loss, right? Whereas the low protein group was actually in a 3-to-1 carbohydrate to protein intake. So if you start to change your mindset, and here's what they saw: no change in body mass, significant increase in fat-free mass in that high protein or reduced carb to protein ratio, significant decrease in fat mass, percent fat, and then also that fat mass and body fat. So obviously increasing protein, but again, it's that manipulating macronutrients, and there's some interesting data out there in addition to this, just giving some application. So then another kind of key piece that is not controversial, but people are very strong about their opinions, is nutrient timing. And I thought, what better place to talk about it than NSCA? And so this is a classic study that basically got us all thinking, and it's kind of old, but I think it's still great. Basically saying, if you take the calories that you normally eat before in morning, evening, and put them around your workouts, what will happen? And basically, this study showed that you're going to double the increases in lean mass, see greater losses in body fat, and that also translate to changes in strength. So then, this is not old. I mean, like the knowledge, we know that we should nutrient time, right? Before and after. Now there's debate on how long is the window, how effective is it? And I say, does it really matter? Like, is it going to help you? And what we know is that, yes, it will help you, it won't hurt you, but maybe the windows aren't that close. So I want to show you kind of a different perspective. Maybe it's beyond body composition. Maybe it's metabolism. Maybe it's recovery. And so it's a nice transition into looking at things a little bit different, metabolically speaking. So I wanted to view this, before I give you some of that nutrient timing application, this is a study that, it's more of a review that nobody ever talks about, and like I said, you guys use it all, so you can use it or think about it differently. But when we talk about metabolism and calories, a calorie is a calorie. There's a lot of debate of, is a calorie a calorie? This is a different way to look at it. Inefficiency happens just like when we put gas in our car, we expend energy, right, or waste energy. The same thing happens with food. And in weight loss, we actually want to be inefficient with our exercise, with our food. So this is a lot of mumbo jumbo down here, but I basically wanted to demonstrate that if I'm eating carbohydrate, that is very efficient for me to make energy. That's why we have carbohydrate, right? Especially during exercise. However, in weight loss, I don't want to be so efficient. And so the most inefficient pathway is actually consuming protein, building a protein, and then expending a protein. So that does not mean I'm going to use amino acids for energy during exercise. Instead, that means I have adequate amino acids available. I stimulate the muscle via resistance training or HIIT. And then I rest, and I rebuild that muscle, and then I go exercise again. It's that constant cycle is very inefficient. And so potentially taking advantage of some of these inefficiencies may potentially help with weight loss. And so just another view, when we look at some of the inefficiencies, carbohydrate and, fat is the most efficient. So if you sit down and have a bunch of peanut butter, it will likely make you fat if you overeat, right, with any macronutrient. But carbohydrate's not far behind, and then notice that protein is least efficient, meaning that I'm going to require more energy to break that down than I am my other macronutrients. So when we look at that, or look at metabolism, I'm just thinking, having you view some things differently when we start thinking about weight loss, or little pockets of areas that we can take advantage of. The other things with metabolism to consider are caloric imbalance. So a lot of times in a weight loss, or if individuals, if we're talking about metabolism, we're worried about overexpending calories or under-eating. This is very common in weight loss, which can influence metabolism or metabolism in a negative way. Intentional weight loss or caloric restriction. And I say intentional because sometimes it's not intentional. Sometimes people are just over-exercising and not meeting caloric needs. And then training status. So you guys probably know this, but just as a friendly reminder, training status, the more trained you are, the more efficient you are. So the more exercise I do, the fewer calories I will burn during that exercise event. So 1, do a new exercise. So I just thought I'd ask, I thought I would be able to see you all, but who swims in here for exercise? Okay, so maybe like 5% of you. So if you all went swimming, you'd burn a whole lot of calories, right? And if you did HIIT in the pool, you'd be wiped. So the idea, though, is if you can stimulate the metabolism or choose exercises that you're less efficient at, you'll burn more calories. So with weight loss or maximizing metabolism, maybe you want to think about it that way. And then also mode, right? So modifying mode. And then that's one of the keys with that higher intensity exercise is that we know it kind of trumps some of that inefficiency, or it allows us to burn some more calories, which I'll show you. So this is a classic view. Just want to demonstrate that with weight loss, basal metabolic rate goes down, some of our fidgeting goes down. However, we're not really sure about our thermic effect of feeding, meaning we think that we can still take advantage of that if we eat, that lower carb to protein ratio, and then exercise adaptive thermogenesis, or how many calories do you burn during exercise, we become more efficient unless you switch the mode and the intensity. So let's draw upon that. So Bill briefly mentioned this, but this is a big passion area of mine, is metabolic adaptation. Sometimes we hear about it as adaptive thermogenesis, and I think it's a little bit misunderstood. But the best way to describe it is that when someone loses weight or is very fit, our metabolism becomes adapted, meaning that we basically can maintain the calories that we need without expending or needing a lot of calories. That's exacerbated with weight loss and underfeeding. And that's driven by mitochondrial adaptations. And why I say that is because that's kind of the whole goal of why we exercise. We want to become more efficient. Our mitochondria doubles and become more efficient. So we want to think about it 2 ways. 1, we want to prevent this from happening or stimulate our metabolism so that it doesn't happen. There's also hormonal changes that happen with metabolic adaptation, which essentially means that generally our catabolic hormones are elevated and our anabolic hormones are decreased. And I'll show you kind of our theoretical model. And so a lot of times if someone becomes very efficient, in weight loss the best example is when we plateau, or let's say you're working with someone who's trying to lose weight and then they stop. For example, sometimes we've looked at some physique competitors. They get so lean that they stop losing fat mass, or that return to normal life, a preferential gain of fat over time. And so let me just kind of show you our theoretical model. And so what happens generally with weight loss is we reduce energy intake, which creates an energy deficit. That's on the left side of the model, which basically results in a decrease in energy expenditure and a decrease in weight, which is all part of weight loss, right? But at some point that catches up and can result in some changes in hormones. But essentially and even Bill's research is supporting some of this, is if we make small dietary changes that can modify or slow this down and prevent that preferential gain of fat over time, or also periodic refeeding, or basically providing that intake. I don't like to call it a cheat day. It's not a cheat day, but essentially increasing calories and macronutrients every certain number of days to kind of maintain metabolism. So this is a kind of an area, the best way to describe it is if you've ever dieted and then gained weight and then lost weight, you likely gain more weight over time, or your clients do, or your research subjects do. So this is an area that definitely needs more exploration, but we have some interesting insight. So I'll give you a practical example here with a female. So here we have kind of the key thing, and what I want to point out is oftentimes, or what the theory is that it's the lean mass that prevents that fat from regaining or stops that cycle of weight regain. So if you can see here, the start of a diet, 19.4% body fat. You can see the lean mass, 145 pounds. End of the diet, they obviously sufficiently lost body fat. They've lost about 10 pounds of lean mass and 15 pounds of fat mass. So this is more drastic, more of like a physique competitor. Obviously, they have to regain weight. You can't maintain that body composition. And so they gain fat more quickly while hormones adjust. And the theory is if you see that late regain, that's essentially potentially where the fat loss or fat regain would stop when lean mass has matched the start of the diet. So just a better even view of why lean mass and your jobs are so important with clients, even in weight loss, right, or preventing weight regain. Okay, so the other kind of view of metabolism and with that macronutrient manipulation, something to consider is oxidation and how much fat are we using. And so I'll be honest, fat oxidation doesn't always lead in fat loss, but it's a concept I want to talk about because I think it's a sound theory. And so basically, if we manipulate macronutrients like they did in this study, essentially high carbohydrate or high carb to protein ratio, in this study they call it a high fat, but it's essentially kind of a low to carb to protein ratio. They demonstrated that high carbohydrate diet blunts fat oxidation. And that's how most of us, most of our subjects, most of our clients eat. If you consume a high carbohydrate diet, you will be less efficient at burning fat for fuel, particularly at rest and during exercise, which is what we were meant to use. And so the idea, too, is by manipulating macronutrients, so in this case, a higher fat, higher protein diet, they were able to increase fat oxidation, which may result in greater fat loss or fat use. This is another classic study that is often overlooked, and so again, giving you some pearls of wisdom. The idea of if we do not consume before we exercise, do not consume food before we exercise, the media tells you that actually burns more fat. That's fasted cardio, good for you, you may be miserable, but it works. Actually, what the science shows is that's not so good for males or females, and essentially shows that food before exercise actually enhances fat oxidation, and it's even more important for women. And so essentially, we know that postprandial or post-food can actually increase fat oxidation. And so that kind of got me thinking, well, what about the type of food we eat before exercise? And so this was, I guess before we get there, energy expenditure is another key piece of the picture, right? So this study then looked at timing of nutrients, protein or carbohydrate, and how it influences energy expenditure in addition to fat oxidation. And so they demonstrated that protein, particularly 18 grams, so nothing crazy, prior to exercise, before high-intensity resistance training, elevates energy expenditure up to 24 hours post. And so partly why I like this is that I used to do the same thing. Why on earth would we eat before we exercise, particularly if we were going to do HIIT or HERT, right? Well, we know that the data shows that you'll burn more fat and you'll also burn more calories. So if weight loss is our goal, convincing your clients or in your research study that food before can actually be more metabolically advantageous. And so this study also supports the type of exercise. So we know that HIIT, on a whole, this is just one study, but elevates energy expenditure more than our endurance exercise or control. But this particular study shows that it's the same despite half as much work. So I'm all about getting it in and getting it done quickly, right, for a bigger bang for your buck. And basically, we know that HIIT will expend more calories both during and after for much less work. So here we're talking about literally 10 minutes of work versus 50 minutes of aerobic exercise can burn the same amount of calories. And so in my lab, we looked at an acute view of this, asking two separate questions. First, we wanted to ask, okay, well, what happens if you eat protein before you exercise versus carbohydrate? And what happens if you do an energy matched, so calorically matched aerobic exercise bout versus a high intensity exercise bout, high intensity interval training bout versus a high intensity resistance training bout? And first, we saw that protein, so that nutrition piece, the protein group significantly increased energy expenditure, 30 minutes, primarily 30 minutes and 60 minutes post. So we know that eating protein may be better than carbohydrate before exercise. And I think this is really important because you ask, obviously I teach college students, but you ask them, what do you eat before you work out? Oh, a banana. So that's your carbohydrate. If you reframe your thinking and add that protein, that could be potentially advantageous for increasing energy expenditure. And then we also see that protein augments fat oxidation up to 60 minutes post-exercise compared to carbohydrate. And then I didn't present the exercise data or the mode data, but basically we saw that the HIIT trumped all three groups when it's matched for energy, meaning that it increases energy expenditure at most and induces fat oxidation most, opposed to aerobic and HIIT. And then we just finished this study really looking at, okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that pre-exercise timing does have some metabolic advantages. We wanted to look, is pre better than post, particularly in women? Because if you've ever looked at the nutrient timing data, there's no data in women, it's all in men. So we are different physiologically, right? And so basically this study looked at a 6-week high-intensity resistance training study, looking at pre versus post-nutrient timing versus a control. And essentially, body composition-wise, there was no difference pre and post. Potentially some of that nutrient timing is showing up in metabolism with our resistance training as well. Basically saying that pre-intake nutrient timing may be advantageous even with resistance training in our energy expenditure as well as our fat oxidation, even in women. And then, just summarizing, there was no difference in some of our strength, our body composition. And then lastly, just that one application study here with some branched chain amino acids. I think this is interesting too. It's based on some old data, how we created this study, but looking at BCAAs between meals, particularly in females. So most people consume it during exercise as a means of protein synthesis, but we really wanted to know how does it elevate or change fat oxidation if you provide branched chain amino acids between meals, so between breakfast and lunch and dinner and sleep. And basically saw a significant increase in energy expenditure by just providing branched chain amino acids, significant decrease in carbohydrate and sugar intake, and also improvements in satiety prior to sleep. So another view of how a minor change in nutrient timing or even supplement use may have a small impact. And so I want to give you two applications here. And so there's a number of ways you can apply this, but I just thought these were kind of interesting. So here we have a female endurance athlete that's young, high carbohydrate intake, very common. And essentially, so here's body fat percentage, 26.2%. VO2 is high, so very trained. You look at her and say, there's nothing to change. Volume is good. When we measured a fat oxidation via RER is what that means, early in was at a 9, basically telling me that she was burning mostly carbohydrate at a very low intensity. That's not really good for performance, not really good for metabolism or for fat oxidation. So essentially, we basically talked with her and we decided together that said, why don't we lower your carbohydrate intake slightly, down to 55%. She's doing volume, she's an endurance athlete, and up your protein intake. So that same concept, lower the carb to protein ratio to a 2-to-1. After 3 months, I'll show you some data, 3 months and 9 months, you can see here you can see body fat went down after 3 months, so to 24%. Lean mass was about the same. Post, you can see body fat went down even more. And then the other piece down at the bottom, VO2 went up slightly. And then her RER was much lower at the same relative component, or you could look at it at, she was able to use fat much longer, which has a glycogen sparing effect, meaning that in a longer endurance bout, she could theoretically go much longer because now she's using fat for fuel. And those were minor tweaks. So let me show you another example here. A young female who is vegan. You can see baseline weight, 22% body fat. You can kind of see baseline stats. Not under consuming calories, so about 2,000 calories. Heavy on the carbohydrates, so you can see 58% carbohydrate, 14% protein. She was complaining of fatigue, just not a lot of energy. And so I'll put that, basically, we didn't change her calories, but modified her protein, said eat more protein. And you can see the breakdown there, so more of a 50% carbohydrate, 26% protein, so same concept, lowering that carb to protein ratio. Pretty dramatic changes, I would say. So you can see how weight actually significantly went up. So 58.5 kilos is where she started, 61.6 is where she ended, about a year over time. If we wouldn't have body composition, she'd probably be pretty distraught, right? But look at lean mass changes, pretty significant. So almost 4 kilograms of lean mass over that year, and training didn't change a whole lot. So you can see how these are just a couple applications. So to wrap it up here, some key pieces. So I'll just encourage you to think about body composition measurement as a tool, not only for tracking fat mass and lean mass, but also injury prevention. And then depending on your clientele, we actually use it a lot for disease prevention and or identification of disease. Increasing lean mass may be a more important component than loss of fat mass too for injury prevention. And that increasing of lean mass may not necessarily be a set protein requirement, but more of a change, or that change from baseline for that individual of about 60% to see an increase in lean mass. Changes in body composition, it may not be saying do one of these crazy fad diets like keto or very low carbohydrate. Maybe it's just saying, okay, instead of having your 1 egg and cereal for breakfast, maybe you have your cereal, you have 2 eggs and a Greek yogurt. It's more food, but you're modifying that carb to protein ratio, or essentially lowering the carbs and increasing the protein. We know that 2 or less than 2 to 1 is kind of that sweet spot based on the data. And then nutrient timing, so that taboo topic I feel like people like to argue. I would say the data suggests that it's important, and maybe that pre-window is it's not maybe going to make a huge difference fat mass and lean mass for a short period of time, but it may make an impact on metabolism, and over time may have an influence. And then metabolism can be influenced by type of calories, as well as timing or lack thereof, or fasting essentially. High carbohydrates diets, fasting prior to exercise may actually be detrimental to fat oxidation. And then consuming that protein versus carbs before exercise may be more advantageous, despite whether it's resistance training or aerobic exercise. And then just a big thank you to my lab team. We know that science doesn't happen individually, so this is my stellar lab team, and we do a lot of great things, and it's fun for me to share it, so a big thanks to them, and a big thanks to NSCA for allowing me to speak. And I think I have enough questions, or time for questions, which is what I was hoping, so happy to answer some questions. Yeah, I can't see, so you'll have to. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So he asked about nutrient timing, let's say before basketball. So I'll refer you, there's a talk specifically on nutrient timing tomorrow, and there's some really great position papers. So there's a lot of details that go into it, but generally it's a full meal about 2 to 3 hours prior to, and then a small bolus of what I would say was more of a lower carb to protein ratio about 30 to 60 minutes prior to that event. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, so he asked about very early in the morning. That's a good question. So I should say that there's some data that if you fast once every couple weeks, that's fine, maybe, advantageous. But if you work out really early, I'd say two things. If you're recreationally active, a good slow-releasing protein before bed. Most people think casein, but actually the data shows that egg whites is a better slow-releasing protein. So some eggs before bed. I would still argue a bolus of protein even if you work out early in the morning. So the data shows that it doesn't have to be a huge meal. 90 calories of protein, that's, not very much, 20 grams of protein. So a glass of milk, 2 glasses of milk. To holler. We good? All right, thank you.